This is To See Each Other, where we explore how people are fighting for the future of rural America and how writing it off hurts us all. I'm George Gale. I'm a longtime community organizer and lifelong Midwesterner. And in this season of To See Each Other, we're heading to one of my favorite places, Wisconsin, to get to know a group of small-town senior citizens fighting for the dignity of the elderly and a better future for us all. In Lincoln County, people for Pine Crest had a few weeks to celebrate their wins. In the spring, some key supporters for keeping Pine Crest county-owned were elected to the Lincoln County Board of Supervisors. And the potential buyers for the home, the Thayers, walked away from the deal the day before their closing date in June. But People for Pine Crest celebrations were short-lived. As we know in organizing, a win or a loss isn't the end. Despite the best efforts of those newly elected members opposed to the sale, the Lincoln County Board of Supervisors moved to sell again. In a real twist, it has been rumored that the Thayers and an unsolicited buyer are also circling Lincoln County. A sale can happen as quickly as 6 weeks. The board, minus a handful of members, is highly motivated to make it happen. In November, as this podcast hits the air, the Lincoln County Board has to lock in its 2025 budget. Those board members who want Pine Crest off the books need to make it happen now. People in Lincoln County are continuing to fight because they know that the county-owned nursing home is a key component of solving the elder care crisis we're facing as a country. In the U.S., more than 70% of nursing homes are privately owned. Yet all the evidence points towards publicly owned nursing homes providing better care and producing better outcomes for the elderly in this country. It's a national issue and a political one that directly impacts the presidential election next week. How will seniors facing down political leaders that would strip them of future possibilities in care vote? In Wisconsin, a swing state, the vote is up for grabs. For a comprehensive view of the impact of Wisconsin and leading the fight for elder care and its impact on the presidential election, I got back together with my friend John Nichols, a journalist, political observer, columnist for The Nation, and importantly, a lifelong Wisconsinite. We recorded this interview in the days before Kamala Harris announced her plan to expand Medicare coverage to help pay for home health aid, Medicare at Home. The policy is aimed squarely at seniors and the millions of Americans who, like me, are caring for both their parents and their children and struggling to figure out how to do both. It is finally a recognition that we have an elder care crisis and it's a major political issue. And as you'll hear from John later, one key to unlocking this election for Democrats and for the care candidates that we have been waiting for. Hey, John, thanks so much for coming in here and talking today. I really appreciate it.
I can't imagine something I'd rather be talking about or something I'd rather talk about it with, which I don't want you to get a big ego. But I'm very excited about the work you're doing because it draws me out of all the other things I cover, all the other things I do, back to something I profoundly care about, which is the condition of my cousins and my aunts and my uncles and people who live in rural Wisconsin. I'm so glad you're working on these issues.
What are the biggest challenges for older folks in Wisconsin? In rural areas in particular, what are some of the big challenges they face?
One of the challenges in rural Wisconsin is access to services. And as you get particularly older and you maybe don't drive as much, you need to be close to a lot of health services. You want to be close to a hospital or at least a very good clinic. You want to be close to a doctor, a dentist, other folks like that. The sad reality is that our rural areas have in recent years really hollowed out in a lot of ways in that regard. And we used to do a whole show on the corporatization of healthcare and how you've ended up with the loss of the local single practitioners replacement with clinics owned by, some big corporation. But that's a big challenge. And then the challenge of continuing care. There is that point where you either choose or are required to go into something that is a more formal care setting, i.e., it could be a retirement home. It could be, something with more medical care associated with it. It could be all sorts of different structures. But this is becoming a huge challenge in rural areas. And I know it full well because of my mom. She's 93 years old. She lives in Walworth, Wisconsin. She has her own little apartment. But boy, she had a little health scare recently, and that put her into the hospital, and then it put her into a rehab situation. And we were on a roller coaster like you cannot believe. And I have to tell you, George, I think I know my way around some of this stuff. I cannot imagine what it would do to somebody who's in an isolated situation, i.e. they're not near their family. Maybe the kids have moved away and stuff like that, and they got to do it themselves. Unbelievably difficult. But it's also incredibly difficult on the families. And I know families in Wisconsin that are really kind of at wit's end right now, today. We could find them today, and you could too.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely have an elder care crisis. How's Wisconsin almost a microcosm for that? And is it becoming a political issue?
Yeah. The broader reality is this. Most older folks want to stay in their home. If you have to leave your home, you want to stay in your community because you are a member of a church or of a community group or of a coffee klatch that goes to a coffee shop on Main Street every morning. But you're a member of something, and that is a part of what keeps you alive and keeps you happy and keeps you, that'll add years to your life, I promise you. Or maybe you're near your grandkids, or maybe you're near your kids, or, one friend that you've known since high school and you just see each other once a week. But somehow that's where you want to stay. And increasingly in our rural areas, what we're saying is, if you want to stay there, you're going to have to pay more than you can afford. That's one element. Or if you want to stay there, I'm sorry, there's nothing there for you. You're going to have to go to, the big town down the road, or you're going to have to go someplace that you've never been. And what I can tell you is we have a broader rural crisis in America and a broader rural crisis in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was a weird state in this regard because when the progressives came to power, this is a political movement of the beginning of the 20th century. When the progressives came to power in Wisconsin, their base was a lot in the rural areas. And so they moved a lot of resources to the rural areas. So weirdly enough, when the rural crises of the last century occurred in other states, they were less profound here because we had successive government interventions that got funding to the schools, that got roads built, that got, an infrastructure out there. And so it made it easier for previous generations to stay in rural areas. In the last 25, 30 years, but especially since Scott Walker was the governor of Wisconsin, who was a guy who had zero concern for rural Wisconsin, that we have just seen a lot of it fray. The rural schools are having a harder time surviving. The rural healthcare infrastructure was having a harder time surviving. The jobs are less. The farms are less supported than they traditionally were. End result is that town that the elder wants to stay in is itself in crisis. It is itself losing a lot of what made it what it was. Federal government sometimes closing the post office, right? Things like that. And so you start to lose the pieces of infrastructure that would make sure that there's a place for our elders. And that's a real challenge. And as these rural counties, as these rural communities struggle to pay their bills, you start to see real debates about whether they can even maintain what minimal infrastructure they have for our elders.
Right. So, how do our politicians get away with ignoring rural voters and the issues they care about, like elder care?
I think that things happen to rural areas often without attention because our media has changed so much. And our newspapers, which used to try to be sometimes statewide and really did try to cover, rural counties and things like that, they've contracted into often the suburbs and even become much smaller. Radio's streamed from someplace else and tends to be sports, crime, and weather. And so the challenge for rural areas is that to get attention, they often have to yell. They have to make noise. And if they don't, they can often end up exploited and have bad things happen without a lot of debate, without a lot of attention. And I think right now in Wisconsin, through some very good organizing and through some very serious concerns, we're starting to have attention paid to rural areas as regards care for our elders and as regards nursing homes and other facilities. And I would want to emphasize that while this is an economic issue and while it is a social issue, a human issue, it's also a media issue. Because when you have a neglectful media, it is so much more possible for bad things to happen. We should want our media to do a lot more rural coverage, and we should encourage our public radio or community radio stations to get out there into those rural areas even more. But we should also recognize the importance of, even as urban folks, supporting those rural folks who are trying to raise a banner, trying to be heard, because it's harder now than it used to be. And it is absolutely vital that we don't neglect rural areas or urban areas that are also often neglected, and just kind of live in this world of nationalized politics that isn't very human. We got to get it down to local politics that is very human. And that's why we have to be conscious of organizing, of protest, of movements that exist in our rural areas, and amplify them, build them up, make sure that they're heard, because that's the only way that we can assure that we get justice for everybody, rural, urban, suburban, wherever you live. That the one thing you're sure of is you won't be neglected. If you have a need, it will be met.
Love that. I mean, what role does Wisconsin play this year in determining who wins the presidency?
Wisconsin, literally, we're at the point pretty much where I think if you put a call in and said you can get a good number of people out in your backyard for a cookout, you could probably get a vice presidential candidate to stop by. It's pretty remarkable what's going on. They're showing up all over. Wausau, smaller cities, mid-sized cities all over. Many cities are now getting their second visit. And there was one day where Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, and J.D. Vance were all in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. So all of that is said, a way of telling you, yes, Wisconsin's decisive. Why is Wisconsin so decisive? It's not an overwhelming number of electoral votes. It's 10. We're just kind of in the range of a big enough state that they're going to pay attention to. Not as big as North Carolina on electoral votes, or Georgia, or a number of other places, but got enough. And we've got one other phenomenon, which is that we just can't decide as a state. We swing between Republicans and Democrats. We've had Republican governors, Democratic governors. One of the few states in the country now that has a Republican senator and a Democratic senator. And we have a very right-wing Republican senator and a quite progressive Democratic senator. We, in the last 6 presidential elections, 4 of them have been decided by under 25,000 votes. Now think about that, George. This is a place where you got millions of people voting and you're down to 25,000 votes. That's precinct by precinct. That is, a nice day on campus, a higher turnout on the UW campus, in Madison, could be decisive in who becomes president of the United States. And so Wisconsin's a big deal. It has been for a long time. It's gotten very used to it. Mm-hmm. It looks like this year it will continue to be a classic battleground state.
And what roles will rural voters in Wisconsin play in this election?
It's a bigger role. It's changing. And this is a big deal. The Democratic Party was nightmarishly awful at this for quite a while. They had historically been quite good at it. Democrats. We had rural Democratic governors, people who came from small towns. Our current governors originally from Plymouth, Wisconsin, which is not a particularly big city. But as we saw that sort of collapse of rural progressive power, isn't that there aren't rural progressives, but gerrymandering and other things made that less of a force. You ended up with a situation where the Democratic Party kind of got into a trap of thinking, well, we're going to win elections by running up the numbers in urban areas. We're going to just organize the heck out of urban areas. And they neglected rural areas to some extent. That meant that the Republicans were like, fabulous. Don't have to fight for this. So they didn't put much energy there. You know what I mean? The whole thing kind of started to fade and get, rural politics got a little bit weaker. And then the Democrats recognized something in 2016. When Donald Trump, Wisconsin always narrowly voted for Democrats. State voted for Dukakis, for Clinton twice, for Gore, for Kerry, for Obama twice. It was just, it wasn't that the Democrats won by much, but they won by a little. And, it got lumped into with the more consistently Democratic states, even though the margins often rather small. Suddenly they lose to Donald Trump, and they start looking at the county maps, and they're like, oh my goodness, if we had just held our traditional rural vote, these are Democrats talking, they were like, we would have won the state. And suddenly it's like, wow, it might not be a bad idea to put some energy back there in those rural areas. Now, there are rural county parties, Democratic groups, that have been begging for attention, right? Folks who meet on that Thursday night, but nobody shows, you know what I mean? It's they show up themselves, but they don't get anybody from outside to come help them. Now, to give you an example, when Tammy Baldwin, the U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, Democratic U.S. Senator, launched her reelection campaign, she launched it in Richland Center, which is a small city out in western Wisconsin. Suddenly, the rural areas are getting a lot of attention, and the Democratic Party is relearning how to talk to rural voters in a serious way and understanding that not every rural person's a farmer. They're getting better at that. And they nominated Tim Walz from Minnesota, who actually represented a rural district. He gets this a little better. That's required the Republicans to up their game. And so we now, this year, in my opinion, have the best competition for rural votes in Wisconsin, the most serious competition for rural votes that we've seen in quite a while. And I think what it is likely to produce is a closer result in rural areas.
Do you think that work, like that attention and intention and investment, could play a defining role in the election?
Oh, sure. What happened in 2016 was a wake-up call for rural Democrats. And they realized they had to do a lot more, and they had to tell the state party it had to do more, et cetera, et cetera. That has created a situation now where they've opened offices. They work year round. They're much more at it. We're starting to see turnout go up in a lot of rural areas. Mm-hmm. And that means that folks are mobilizing the folks who didn't show up. One of the things that I would suggest to somebody who covers politics is a lot of those folks who didn't show up in rural areas are Democrats. Mm-hmm. But they didn't think it mattered. They just didn't think that they could have an impact. Now, as they're starting to see, wow, if we show up, maybe in this county, the Democrats only get 42% of the vote. But that 42% is enough to push the whole state numbers up when you're deciding elections by 20,000 votes. That they, okay, I'll make the effort. That's profound.
Mm-hmm. Two questions on this whole long-term care issue. Mm-hmm. Do you see it becoming an issue that will impact elections? And I'll put my 2 cents in. I feel like historically it's almost been like the question of care has been something like that's our own fault. The fact that we can't figure out the care system is our own fault. We're supposed to do that. But do you feel like that's shifting, and do you see the issue of long-term care becoming a political winner, possibly?
Sure. I think that care in general is the issue of the future. The moment where this will become an issue is where we see an intersection of all the organizing that's being done. And it's a lot more organizing, it's a lot more focused, it's a lot more identifying of the issues with a political leader, mm-hmm. or maybe a group of political leaders, but it's often an individual mm-hmm. who actually knows how to talk about this thing, goes out and does it, right? And I will tell you, when we start to get political leaders who, A, recognizes a moral issue, not just a political issue, not just an economic issue, but a moral issue, mm-hmm. and begins to talk about it as such, and begins to tell those anecdotes of the daughter trying to find a place for the mom, of the guy whose wife has passed and his kids have moved on, and he's trying to stay in his little apartment. And I got to tell you, I'm sitting here with you, George, talking to you about this. And even as I talk about that, because I know those people mm-hmm. I feel a tear in the back of my eye. Mm-hmm. I do.
Yeah.
And the reason is because I know how painful those stories are. When you get political leaders who could talk about that and say they're going to do something about it, that is going to be a transformative moment. And the best way I can sum it up is not in the context of the care debate, although it should be, mm-hmm. And it can be. In the context of another economic debate back in the era of civil rights. Remember, the March in 1963 was for jobs and justice, right? It was economic and social, racial justice, right? They put these things together. Mm-hmm. Lyndon Johnson gave a great speech in that period, around the time of the Selma Montgomery march. I believe he gave it to the House of Representatives, and it was referred to as his "We Shall Overcome" speech.
Mm.
And he had a lot of elements in it. But he brought the economic side in. And one of the things is he recalled that he was a teacher in a rural school in the 1920s. He had gone to teacher college, and he took some time off and was teaching in a rural school with very impoverished students. And he was so overwhelmed by it that he took money out of his own salary, which was very small, to, help buy food and, help him out. And and when he gave this speech to Congress in, I think, 65, around there, he said, at the time I wanted to help them, but I couldn't help them enough. And a lot of time has passed. Those kids now are adults. They have children and grandchildren. I wasn't able to do enough to help them when I was a teacher, but now I am the President of the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world, and I'm going to help them. When we get a political leader or a group of political leaders that speak in that way about our elders and their children, their grandchildren trying to help them, and their communities that are trying to support them, and brings that across, I think it will be a wildfire movement. I think we could go from our neglectful and failed approaches to exquisite, positive, radical change that would make conditions so much better. And I think that could come very fast because great organizers have already done the work. So yeah, I'm hopeful.
A transformation in how we care for each other. That's what's possible in these fights and what's necessary for our future. Every day in America, 10,000 of us turn 65. By 2040, only 16 years from now, the number of adults over the age of 85 is expected to more than double. This fight for care and dignity for the elderly is being led by older folks. And what is clear is that this fight is not just for them, but for all of us and for future generations. People for Pine Crest and the battles playing out across Wisconsin are not just about preserving a few beloved nursing homes. It is a fight against the ideology that it's not the role of government to provide or support healthcare for its people. A fight to show these publicly owned nursing homes are not a relic of the past, but they are actually the future, and we need more, not less of them. Just as we need more and bigger public investments in long-term care, period. We know what's best for our future. Care that is deeply rooted in the community and accountable to the people it serves, not to its shareholders looking to cut costs to increase profit. All kinds of care: elder care, child care, disability care, community care. The fight for elder care is a fight that drives votes and should motivate not just aging voters, but all of us who have aging loved ones and hope to age ourselves. Now, an election hangs in the balance. Our big ask of you, not to star and review this episode, not to share on social, though of course that'd be great too. Our big ask of you is to get out the vote for you and for our future. Hey, thanks for being with us this season. It means the world to us that so many people listen in. Please check in with us at toseeachother.org to get updates on these fights and ways to get involved. For now, it's back to organizing. Oh, and a very big election. To See Each Other is a project of Edition and the Mashup Americans. It is executive produced by Amy S. Choi and Rebecca Lair of the Mashup Americans and George Gale of Edition. Senior editor is Sarah Pellegrini. Story consultant is Jeff Seelbach. Lead researcher is Melissa Lowe. Production managers are Shelby Sandlin and Andy Harris. Sound designer is Pedro Rafael Rosado. Original music composed by the Brothers Tang. And special thanks to Jen Cadillo and Mike McMahon of Edition. Especially Mike, who supported the people for Pine Crest in this podcast in every possible way.
Okay, so Mike, say something smart.
I got it. I got something smart to say. We should stop the sale of Pine Crest.
Stop the sale.